Hello, folks. This is Radio Squid Jigger episode 5. And this is actually, I think, the second one that we've turned out in the space of only 1 week. So it's almost like we're keeping a schedule or something.
We're pretty close.
We're pretty close, yeah. The slacking part has been completely on me because I've given myself the task of doing our sort of podcast and web integration, and I've been slacking on that because I've been getting my booty kicked at work. Yeah, we've actually been recording these consistently week after week, which is great. Radio Squid Jigger is a discussion about whatever the hell we want to talk about, but generally revolving around politics and money. And international issues, international kerfuffles, as we like to call them. My name is Thad. On the other side of the phone is my friend Josh. Say hello, Josh.
Good evening.
There we go. Josh is in. Where are you now, Josh?
I am actually in Springfield or Westfield, Massachusetts.
Westfield, Massachusetts. So he's on the East Coast. I'm in Minneapolis, at least for the time being. You can reach us I'm at TCB, as in taking care of business, at squidjigger.com, and Josh is at josh@squidjigger.com. And so far, we're the only two people on the planet who use that email address for each other, but still, we hope that's going to change. So we're talking about a couple of things this week. Let's see, only about half of it is about the Middle East, which is good. We're trying to keep our Middle East content down.
A new record.
Yes. So sort of halfway reasonable.
People keep just doing stuff there. I don't know why they won't just take a break.
Just relax.
Like the French in the summertime. Just calm down. Like take a week off.
We should tell like the Gulf, the GCC that they should be like the French and just take August off. Just go. Just done.
I think it would actually be really sound advice for everyone involved. I don't think we quite have the gravitas to make that recommendation yet, but maybe by August we will.
By August we'll feel like we need to. All right, so the first thing we're going to start off talking about that is not the Middle East is there was a story that it's kind of hard. It was like everything we talk about, we think it's underreported, but it's especially hard to talk about because it's fairly complex stuff with European bank rescues. In this case, they were in Italy. So we're going to talk a bit about that. Basically, the shortest version of the story, and then we'll sort of get to figuring out some of the background, is there were two large banks in the area of Venice that were big enough that they were a real genuine concern to the banking stability in the entire country of Italy. And they were in bad enough shape, they were essentially worth nothing. If you would have been willing to buy a cup of coffee, you could have been able to trade it for these banks. And the problem essentially was the Italians saved banks that were in similar condition about a year ago, according to the rules you're supposed to use, and it was a political disaster. So this time they just sort of changed their mind about how they're going to rescue their own banks and did it in a way that was more politically expedient, but that went against all of the rules that were set out by the EU for how banks should be taken care of, how banks that are failing should be taken care of. And this all goes back to 10 years ago and how things were set up with the big financial crash back then. But it shows a lot of sort of fissures as well in the EU. So let's try to talk a little bit about that. So talk about the stories that sort of led you to thinking about this, because one of the weird things about this is I follow the finance more, so I'm always kind of pushing to talk about the finance stuff. And Josh is always like, "Oh, who cares? We can talk about bombs." But
this is true.
But this one you were saying, no, this is an important story. This is crazy. So talk a little bit about why you think this is crazy.
I didn't initially think much of it because it just said the Italians bailed out a couple of banks, and then there are two things that flew up, a couple of oh wait, what just happened?
Right.
First of all, the bailout in terms of Italy's finances is kind of significant. I think when we throw numbers in the billions around in the States, or when we're talking about the entire European Union, we're kind of what's 17 billion here, there? I mean, that's
right.
Just some stealth fighters or something.
Right.
But it's actually an interesting comparison I read was that it's the equivalent of the entire Italian defense budget for a year.
Right.
Was this bailout. And it's all coming out of, it's not a pan-European thing, which is kind of leads us right into point two.
Right.
Is that they're basically breaking the rules of how Europe thinks banks, the agreements that Europe thinks banks should be undone and wound out, is that the senior investors still take a hit. Whereas in this case, as you mentioned, like the political expediency part, like it's just so unpopular for that to happen that they decided we're just not going to do that. I think one of the articles I read on it was like a very Italian bailout. Like it was just like, we're not going to do that. Like
exactly.
Those are the rules, but we're just not going to do that. We don't like that. The weird thing, and I want actually to ask you about this, is that as far as I can tell, the EU basically just said, yeah, that's fine. Like, and I don't understand how that happened.
Well, more or less. But the joke I was going to make was, it's like the Italian banks are like from that Eddie Izzard joke, where it's like they're all like smoking cigarettes and going around on scooters saying ciao.
Yeah, exactly. It's like Roman holiday.
Right,
like,
right.
Well, we bailed them out. We broke all the rules for the economic union. Ciao.
Ciao.
Like, it doesn't matter.
Ciao. Yes.
But I kind of need you to explain to me a bit more detail about the rules that they broke, and also why, apparently, as far as I can tell, whatever mechanism that the EU has for enforcing this basically is just like, yeah, we're just going to let it happen.
Yeah, well, the basic part of the rule is, if the EU comes in and puts money into it, it has to be according to the rules that the EU sets for how you wind down a bank. And the EU decides if they're going to put money into it, if they're going to essentially put their stamp on it, or if it can be done according to local rules that are country by country. And one of the reasons that this was a big deal was because, like, normally when a bank goes under, like, a bank doesn't have much in the way of assets, right? It has cash on hand, it has some offices, it has a little bit of goodwill, and then it has loans. And for a bank, the loans are the assets. That's actually what you want. The deposits are actually a liability. So when a bank winds down, there's not much to be rid of. You wind up chopping up the good debt and the bad debt, and that's all there is. So the idea is, but then you wind up having to decide who gets paid first. And in a bank bankruptcy, the first tier bondholders get paid off first, and they get paid off in full. If there's any money left over, preferred bondholders and then insured depositors are covered by the government, and then secondary debt holders, and then whatever is left. And usually, if a bank goes under, there's nothing for the secondaries ever. So the EU made a rule essentially saying that even the senior debt holders, if you take in EU money for your bank bailout, even the senior debt holders, the people who thought they were going to get paid at 100 cents on the dollar, have to take some 8, 10, 12% cut. So everyone has to suffer some degree when a bank fails. So that's why they call them bail-ins and not bailouts. And the way they got around this was, if they say a bank is not systemically important, if the EU banking system says this bank isn't systemically important, then you can do it however the hell you want. So your country can go and take care of that yourself. And that's essentially what the EU did this time, is they just decided, even though these banks were important enough for the Italian government to come in and save them, that they somehow weren't important enough for the European Union banking system to save them. So they just said, well, you can use the rules that you used 5 years ago just because. And then, last year, essentially the same thing happened in Spain, and the Spanish banks were not allowed to do this. So if you're Spanish, sorry, you're not allowed to say ciao and run off on your scooter. You got to play by the rules. But if you're Italian, you get to. So the Italians sort of cooked up this very sweet deal where they got to guarantee a bunch of assets that were politically important and not upset anybody, and sort of wind this bank down the way they wanted to do it. And the real problem, I think, going forward is, now if you're important enough, I guess you don't have to play by the rules, right?
My takeaway, not having quite the subtlety or grasp of finance that you have, is that basically, if you're big enough,
Right.
And Italy being, from what I understand, the third largest economy after France and Germany, is basically like, oh, well, you're one of the top, you're one of the, platinum European members.
Right.
You wear the silk robe and, you don't have to worry about rules.
Right.
Like, that's for like poor countries like Portugal.
Exactly.
And, like,
that's for
whatever that, resort town that we call Greece is,
right. Right.
My takeaway is that, and there was actually an article I read that said that there's now effectively like a two-speed, like two-tiered system in Europe. And, you're either the top three, maybe we could throw, I'm pretty sure that Belgium and the Low Countries are doing especially well too. But like you're either like one of the top assets, you're in the top ranking of the EU, or you're one of the less desirable countries, and German makers show up and like start parsing out stuff and like forcing austerity on you and stuff like that.
And start making you sell off your national parks.
Is kind of, if you think about the long-term repercussions about countries staying in the EU, which is already kind of a problematic thing, I think a big deal. Like we already have at least one country probably leaving, and I feel it's to me it kind of sets off an alarm bells of things not being fair, and and also this is on top of the fact that all European countries have to have the same currency.
Right.
So they can't devalue their currency and make their products or their labor cheaper inside that market, or any market for that matter.
Or also make their debt easier to pay off as well.
Or to make their debt much more manageable. So they're stuck in a system that basically gives them less flexibility than other countries in the same system, and also doesn't allow them to ever leave and at least use their lower value to try and get back on their feet again.
To try to get back in the game.
I feel is like just destined to failure.
Yeah.
If you're going to have that double standard.
It's interesting. Both Josh and I have a friend of ours on Facebook who is this sort of like, rabidly, religiously, morally pro-European person. And he works for nonprofit banks and stuff, like for NGOs, and he's a good guy. But there seems to be a certain just unwillingness to see some pretty obvious things among very super pro EU people. That if you're Greece or Portugal, and then especially some of the smaller countries that are still trying to get in the EU. I mean, if you're Poland or if you're Hungary, it has to make you think twice. Like, wait a minute, I have to go out and take a beating if my bank makes a mistake, but if an Italian or a French bank has a problem, we'll make sure they're reasonably well taken care of.
Forget about it.
Yeah, exactly. Forget about it. So I also don't think that the story, we're going to be able to talk about this for, I think, as long as we do this discussion.
No, I think this was just, I think, the tip of the iceberg of something that's going to be a continual problem, which is one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it and get on it right now.
Right.
Because I think this is a major sign point of why the EU is going to have some problems unless they reverse course or change their structure. Do something. And there's this great line in well, but I won't go into that. There's if even a small number of the countries in the EU feel like they're not getting a fair deal with something as important as banking, that's a real problem, because the market integration is what is the whole point of that institution. Is that you no longer have to worry about selling your stuff in Greece or in Poland or in Portugal. You can sell it to anybody there. So if everyone doesn't get along and everyone doesn't agree on these sorts of things, that's a fundamental existential problem. And I mean, if I were a politician and I were trying to run for office in Lisbon, I would say, hey, we're getting screwed. Like this, come on, come vote for Portugal. And we saw some of that happen, and some countries seemed receptive to it. Obviously, the British were. The French were not. The French eventually voted overwhelmingly for a very young, very classically pro-EU
elite sort of guy. But man, if I was working to try to run for office in one of those smaller countries, that would be something I think would have a lot of resonance.
Well, absolutely, and I think it's worth pointing out that the French are, they're in a position where they are going to be in the top tier of the EU, so they will get that sweet deal if that needs to happen.
Always,
because it's kind of easy for the French to say like, oh, fraternity across all of Europe united. It's like, a bunch of Greeks are just like, oh God, fuck you.
That's right.
Like just. And the Irish are just like, yeah, I don't know how I feel about that. And, Portuguese, Spanish behind them. Like, the Italians, they're the third largest economy. They don't politically seem to run the EU to the level that France and especially Germany do.
Right.
We were just kind of proven that you don't even have to really give a damn about the EU. Like, if they just deem you a big enough risk, they're just it's kind of the whole too big to fail thing.
Right. And
is basically what I think we're seeing.
Right. They're going to wind up changing the rules in your favor to the extent that they have to sort of to prop up the club.
I have another question for you. You mentioned Macron. Here's another question. Do you feel that the EU got a little complacent, that they felt like the whole populist, nationalist, we're going to leave the EU thing got kind of quelched by that vote, and that they're just like, we can get away with anything now? As long as that election went our way, like, do you feel like there was kind of a bit of hubris and confidence because of that vote?
That's like the biggest puffball question in the world to me. What I tell people is that everyone talks about in the primary, there were 5 candidates, right? There were 4 roughly centrist candidates, and there was Le Pen. And Le Pen got 20% of the vote. And Le Pen was not just anti-EU, was anti-immigrant, was all the things that everyone seems to be horrified of in the EU right now. But the hardcore left-wing candidate in France, the Bernie Sanders guy in France, Bernie Sanders, I guess you would say, he got 20% of the vote. And he was not just anti-EU, he wanted to pull out of the euro. So he wanted to 86 the common currency and essentially scrap the EU as it was functioning now, because it's like, I don't know, run by Monsanto or some shit, right? Like, there's whatever weird reason that hyper-leftists think everything is against them. So 40% of the French public in the primary voted for explicitly, aggressively anti-EU candidates. And Macron eventually, because, and I think, of the 20% who voted for Le Pen, every single other human being in France would have not voted for Le Pen. So of course it was like he won, and won by a lot, and won in the elections after that. But that's a very long answer. I emphatically think that the results in France have painted over what is still going to be a long-term problem. I just don't see that not being. And also, by the way, I'm pro-EU. I 100% internationalist. I went to college type person. But I think that they're going to have to be more problems like this coming along. I'm kind of surprised the other countries have not been as upset with the Italian deal the Italian job as they were. But yes, I do think that the French election lets everyone sort of. I mean, it's like, if Hillary would have won by 2 points instead of losing by a quarter of a point, then we all would have wrapped ourselves in a big blanket and saying, "Oh, thank God that Donald Trump guy is so crazy, no one would ever vote for him." When in fact, 35% of the population, will lay down their lives for the guy.
Actually, that I remember somebody saying before the election, quite prophetically, like, there no matter what happens, there's still going to be like 40% of the country that absolutely supports Donald Trump.
Yes.
And that's not a thing that's going to go away.
Right.
Any way you cut it.
Right.
There's a part of the population that is no longer thinks the system is working for them.
Yes.
And that is going to be an ongoing problem.
Yes.
So I think it's actually a great analogy that I think Europe seems, I feel like the win in France for lack of a better word, for the populists, for the internationalists, I think put some blinders on.
Yeah.
But I think, and you're right, I don't understand why this isn't a much bigger deal in at least the European press. Like, I understand Americans ignoring it.
Right,
but it barely showed up as a blip on most even European press outlets, as far as I could tell, and no countries seem to make any official statements condemning it, as far as I could tell. Like nobody, Portugal, Spain, Greece,
Yeah.
like I didn't hear anything from anybody that I'm aware of.
There were some very small rumbles here and there, and that was about it. I mean, I think part of it is, as I've said before here, and I'll say again, part of it is, finance is complex. And it's that way on purpose. They make it complex, so it's hard to figure out how they're robbing you. Because if they just showed up and like broke in your house and took your stuff, then you'd be like, wait a minute, that's wrong. But if you can do that through 25 different structured companies that are based in the Bahamas, who knows? So it's complex on purpose. So I think that's part of it. And I also think that at this point the EU is so fatigued with the war in Syria and the refugee issues and recovering from our recovery from the Great Recession has been not especially fantastic. But huge chunks of Europe have been done even worse. So I just think they're a little bit tired of worrying about stuff. So maybe the Italians,
the same way we have Twitter fatigue, they have like economic news fatigue,
exactly.
and it just doesn't kind of rolls off their back,
like banking crisis fatigue. Like, yeah, we can't deal with it. Yeah, but I do think we're going to see more of this, and we're going to be talking about it again. And there will be a time when someone is going to stand up and say, no, that's not cricket, as you said. I love that phrase. That's just not cricket.
That's just not cricket.
That's just not cricket. Okay, well, so we'll talk about this.
That it's not cricket.
Pardon?
Nothing. So yeah, I think we've covered that one though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
we'll hear from it again, as you say.
Right. So the next thing we want to talk about was we talked about. This has only now been it's like 3 or 4 weeks into the GCC issue with Qatar. And the funny thing is, we did one of these. I think the Saudis came out on a Monday in Saudi Arabia, and we were talking on a Sunday, so it happened like that same day, and we were just like, "What the hell?" I mean, it sort of.
I think we were blindsided, and also I think all of our mea culpa on a couple of things. Definitely this situation. I kind of thought before the demands came out, I kind of thought this would blow over.
Right.
I kind of thought that somebody would back down and Washington would jump in and talk everyone down, give everybody some nice shiny fighter planes.
Exactly.
Especially when the F-15 sale went on to Qatar right after the whole thing started up.
Yeah.
And there was an arms sale directly to Qatar, within a couple days.
Yeah, $12 billion. So, and they're like, look, we got stripper money over here.
So I kind of thought this would blow over and it wouldn't be a big deal. And as far as I can tell, everybody is doubling down.
Yes.
Which I just don't. So we have the 13 demands.
Right. So
which are basically unachievable.
Essentially, yes.
I believe one of the Qatari foreign minister said something along the lines of just designed to be rejected.
Right.
And they are just it's. And they say it's an attack on their sovereignty, and it really is.
It is.
It's just completely unreasonable demands where the Saudis basically want to run.
Right.
Okay, I should specify that the Gulf Cooperation Council is not just made up of the Saudis.
Right. Yes.
But practically a lot of the times, a lot of the decisions are run from them. Although, actually, I hear that the United Arab Emirates actually has a really big hand in this particular thing. We'll get into that.
Yes.
So anyway, I'm just kind of shocked that it came down to a demand list with a time limit.
Yes, a short time limit.
A 10-day time limit, which has now expired as of Sunday.
Right.
With no solution in sight.
And finally today, I think it was today actually. The Qataris sent a letter to the Kuwaitis, which was already sort of a slap in the face because they weren't even talking to the GCC or the countries themselves. They were talking to the people that were trying to mediate the thing, and the Saudis and the Emiratis were saying, we're not interested in mediation. It's a yes or a no. So the Qataris sent a letter via the Kuwaitis saying, we're willing to talk about this, but what the fuck? more or less. I think I'm paraphrasing a bit.
It sounds better in its original Arabic.
That's right.
But the other thing is, the other interesting turn of events, I actually had not heard about that letter, but what I did hear about is that the Saudis, because the deadline expired on Sunday, they then said, we are extending our deadline by 48 hours.
Right.
Which I feel is like the absolute pussiest thing you could possibly do.
Right.
Like, and quite honestly, with Mohammed, I always call him MSB. I forget his full name.
Right.
Mohammed bin Saleh.
Yeah. Bin Salman, I think. Anyway, whatever. Well, the young guy.
MSB. We'll just call him MSB from here on out. He seems to almost be like the Saudi Trump. Like, I shoot from the hip. Like, I tell it like it is. And I start a war in Yemen just because, it seemed like a good idea at the time.
Right.
And he started this entire thing, and now 10 days in, I think the expectation was that the Qataris would just cave in right away, that there would be no way they could possibly stand on their own feet, which I think, quite honestly, likely has something to do with Trump's visit there, where he probably led them on to believe that the U.S. would totally back any move that they made, because it's fascinating to hear. I've heard tales of two people meeting Trump on opposite sides of the healthcare issue, and I know you and I hate domestic politics, but I think we have to bridge in here a little bit.
Right. Well,
where one person who's like, really, medium centralist Republican is like, well, I can't let my state totally not have this stuff. I'm going to get voted out of office, so we need to adjust it this way. And then somebody else is like, this isn't the repeal thing that I sold my conservative district. Like, we need to get harsher than this. And he makes the short version of that story is that basically both people felt like they were going to get what they wanted walking out of that meeting, back to back. And I feel like the Saudis were sold a bill of goods by Trump that he subsequently just doesn't care about, and that it seems really obvious that Rex Tillerson has no interest in whatsoever, and that the Saudis just, instead of backing down from a situation that they didn't quite understand, are just doubling down. And now, which is, wow.
Yes.
You're already screwing up in Yemen. You're just gonna. It's an incredibly aggressive foreign policy for a country that has traditionally always tried to be like the silent partner.
Right. And part of that too. I think the press calls him MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, who's the young guy, the 31-year-old kid. He also just officially became the crown prince in the last 2 weeks. Now he's, everyone who watches this stuff has seen that he's having an increasingly vast role within the government, and he's getting more and more important posts. And his cousin or uncle, who was the previous crown prince, was getting pushed out of the way. But this is very much his thing. The war in Yemen was his thing. We have to stop those Houthi terrorists in Yemen. And then this thing, we have to stop those Qataris from doing all the same shit that we do. So this is definitely like him, throwing his dick out there, saying I'm in charge now. I'm the guy. But I agree. There has to. Of all the countries in the world who would have run this past the U.S. and the Brits and the Europeans, and the Russians before doing something like this, Saudi Arabia would have been top on that list. Don't you agree that they were always they were the slowest moving group around?
No, this is a cautious group of people who had a good thing going for them, who have an incredibly unpopular culture in foreign policy of supporting, heavy wasabiist, they're practically the reason wasabiist terrorists like Al-Qaeda exist in the first place. It's totally their dogma that has recruited and created these things. They send their practitioners far and wide to teach their particularly crappy form of Islam, my opinion.
Right.
I feel the need to separate out the fact that your mileage may differ, but I feel that in terms of doctrine and religion, the particular flavor of Muslim that the Saudis sell is totally shitty and bad.
Who they pay for?
And they tend to know that they're unpopular, and they tend to keep a really low profile and not fuck anything up. And when they really need something from the Americans, they buy the appropriate congressman, often indirectly by, well, we're going to buy a bunch of C-17s just because we know that's in your district. Do we have a use for them? No. Do we know how to apply them? No. Doesn't matter. We're just going to polish them all day. That's fine.
Right.
And they would just kind of do that kind of thing. They're usually like the laid back. They're financial people. They're barely even really a country. They're kind of almost like a finance block that likes to make everything murky, as you talked about with your Italian example. Like, they generally try to stay in the background and make everything complicated enough that you never notice they're really attached to it.
Right. And
so jumping right out and actually have Saudi planes bombing another country, which has never happened before, as far as I know.
Yep.
In Yemen, and then just blockading a member of their own organization that they run. It's just like really oddball politics. I don't quite know what they're trying to accomplish, and I don't think any of it's really being that successful, because if anything, it seems like Qatar is just run to Iran and surprisingly Turkey.
And Turkey, exactly. Like that's the next astonishing piece of the story, because as we said before, first, Qatar has the largest U.S. air base in the region. A huge Air Force installation, intelligence installation, forward staging installation. Like the U.S. can't do a whole lot of stuff without their air base in Qatar. And then and then what happened in the past couple of days, Josh?
Turkey started sending troops there.
Troops and tanks.
And tanks.
Yes.
Like they're actually going to put they're kind of almost going to pull a U.S. of we're going to have some armored personnel carriers with Turkish flags running around, and if you try and invade us or bomb us, then it becomes a Turkish problem.
Exactly.
Which is just, and then that's a NATO country, which makes it even weirder.
Right.
So I mean, it's just like, where did any of this come from? I didn't know that Qatar had any serious relations with Turkey at all, and all of a sudden there are Turkish tanks being offloaded there.
Right.
It's kind of mind-boggling to me. I thought I was in touch with the world a little bit, and I kind of read the newspaper a lot, and I am just at a loss.
Yes. And I think it's also just what you say as well, in that one of the reasons why the U.S. has a whole bunch of troops in the demilitarized zone in South Korea is it's just saying, if you blow this place up, then you're going to blow up Americans. So. And I think it's the reason why NATO has tiny little bunches of installations in Latvia and in Lithuania and Estonia for the exact same reason.
It's always been traditionally referred to as a tripwire.
Right.
The troops themselves generally refer themselves as speed bumps.
Oh, speed bumps.
and that basically, we're just here to slow you down until the actual until the party comes.
Right.
We're going to be run over and killed instantly, but. We'll slow you down by 5 minutes.
Right.
And we'll make sure, because we're dead, America will have to throw its weight down.
Right. The only sort of possible semi-rational reason why Turkey would suddenly be writing to this to the safety of the Qataris is the Qataris are major supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, who are a group of Islamists that the Egyptians and the Syrians and also the Saudis would actually murder every last one if they could. They genuinely do hate those people. And
I think that's actually true of pretty much every Arab country in the region.
Yes.
I mean, you could probably throw the Jordanians and anyone else.
Fair point. But Erdogan's Turkey has always been much more friendly with the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Qataris have also been fairly open sponsors, like Muslim Brotherhood guys who get chased out of their own country. If they're important enough in the organization, will actually go and live in Qatar, and they have offices and addresses. If you want to get your Muslim Brotherhood driver's license or some shit.
We can also add the Taliban. We can also add Hamas. Qatar has they always view themselves as kind of the Arab Switzerland.
Yes, that's right.
Always,
yes.
To some extent, they do support these groups, I think, but also I think it's important to note that they consider themselves like a neutral ground.
Right,
That
right.
they feel like they're the place where they feel, actually Switzerland is an even better example in that they feel like they're like a banking hub and an open free trade hub and a political, like, everyone can come here and not get assassinated, unless the Israelis are being really snarky kind of thing.
Right, right.
You know?
Right. So if you can put even a tiny little bit of a reason why Turkey would do this, perhaps it's because they are somewhat more sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood, and any chance that the Turks can get to tweak the noses of the Egyptians, they'll take. And to tweak the noses of the Saudis, they'll also take. But still, this has all happened in the past month. It's not like Turkey and Qatar had some long-standing military and strategic set of plans they were working on. It's just, Turkey was like, oh, we'll show up with tanks, and then if our guys die, it's a problem.
Well, actually, it would be fair to say that they've been thinking about this for a while, and it was something that I think was voted on the Turkish legislature as far back as March.
Oh, it was? Oh,
I
was wrong about that.
But I mean, I think it was one of those symbolic things that, like, well, we're not going to actually send troops there.
Okay.
Like the fact that like cargo planes are delivering stuff is definitely a reaction to the current crisis. And either way, we're still talking like a couple months ago. We're not talking about like a deep-rooted alliance. We're still talking very recent. I have two excuses for Turkey.
Okay.
One, I think Erdogan, I think the Recepticons just feel like they can do no wrong.
Fair enough.
And also I think they want to I think they have a very Ottoman approach to the area and just think, well, this is all ours anyway.
Fair enough.
Any chance we can insert ourselves into the politics of the area, if somebody's just going to invite us in, then we're going to do that. Although it's interesting that basically the two countries that are backing Qatar in this situation are Iran and Turkey,
right? Who are
on absolutely opposite sides. When you go to Syria, they're backing opponent groups, but they're both backing Qatar against Saudi Arabia, which is kind of just, again, we're getting into super bizarre land as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
The second thing I have to think about is that it might very well be because of Syria that Qatar and Turkey are backing some of the same groups. And they might have already had some previous dealings because of that. That's what I'm kind of thinking, that there's something unpublicized in their relationship, and that they've had a secret relationship. They've been, cheating on each other with all the other Arab countries, like with each other for a while now. Or not that Turks are Arabs, but cheating on the rest of the GCC, and that's probably part of the friction and the problem.
Right.
And that maybe they're not quite guilty of exactly the crimes they're accused of, but maybe they are guilty of something else that the Saudis can't publicize themselves without, blatantly exposing the fact that they support terrorism as well.
Right.
Or minimally that they support very incredibly Islamicist groups in Syria that generally like to remove people's heads.
Right.
So I suspect there's something like that going on, and I suspect the timing might have something to do with our other subject.
Yes. Okay. Well, so then let's close up Qatar and say that again, we're almost certainly going to talk about this more. Just because it's so batshit crazy, like it just makes
it's a titanic shift in the Gulf region.
It makes it makes no sense at all. This is not something that has to happen. The world is not wildly different than it was 6 months ago.
And it's not going to help either country. I feel
no.
It's not I don't see how this is going to make Saudi Arabia really have a happier day at the end of the day. But it's clearly giving Qatar a lot of problems.
Yes.
Before we leave the topic completely, so the current status is 48 hours on top of the original 10-day deadline.
Right.
Where do we think Saudi Arabia, or the Gulf Council in general, is going to go with this? What's the next step for them? Because it seems very obvious that Qatar is not going to yield. They're surprisingly resilient. I mean, actually, once the demands came out, the demands were just unmeetable.
Yeah.
So before that, I thought they would give in pretty readily. When the demands came out, they were just designed to fail. So now nobody's going to back down. 2 more days were given. Pretty sure Qatar isn't giving in. what's the next step for the Gulf Cooperation Council?
Yeah, I mean the nightmare scenarios is someone starts actually shooting at each other, and we all make fun of the Saudis and how they don't really have a military, but they still have a lot of nice equipment they can drive, and
it's very shiny.
Yes, and they do fly those airplanes over to Yemen and kill people.
I feel it's worth pointing out that if the Turks are involved, the Turks are to the Saudi Arabians, like, that's pretty much Delta Force to the Peace Corps,
right?
Like, so that's not going to be like a fun conflict for the Saudis to jump into.
Yes,
even if they were actually willing to push it that far,
right? But so that's so the only thing I can possibly figure is that everyone just stops talking about it. But again, I don't see how that happens either. Like I'm a pretty conspiratorial thinker, and I think pretty dark things about us as a species. So I can usually find something dumber and stupider and more dangerous and more self-destructive that can be done. But I'm kind of out of ideas on this one. So, like, I mean, again, if you said these 13 demands have to be met or we won't budge, and then the other side says we absolutely cannot do any more than like one half of two of those things. Like how do you move? What do you think? How do you back down from this?
This guy does not strike me as, and I'm talking about MSB here.
Yeah,
he does not strike me as a back down guy.
No, he doesn't at all.
So to me, the question is, how does he escalate? There are more economic moves he can make, and he has to make some moves. He can't. I mean, he already looks ridiculous by adding 48 hours to it.
Yes,
because it's clearly something they're not going to do. And I think at this point it's safe to say that this guy is a little out of touch with reality.
Probably.
I mean, initially it was just like, okay, Yemen, like, America had Iraq, so clearly we screw up too. So, like, everyone makes mistakes.
Right.
But, like, if you went into this with those 13 demands and 10 days later they weren't met, and you think that 2 days is going to change the answer,
it's going to make a difference.
All you did is just look weak. Like, you just look like, oh, okay, well, this is the line of death. You cross it, you die.
That's
right. Gaddafi, one of my favorite, dictators of my youth.
Yes.
And he's like, okay, well, help you cross this line, you die. Adding 2 days to it, like, kind of really weakens the message a lot.
Well,
but at the same time, I don't think he's a guy who's going to back down. So, but I still think it'll be purely economic. I don't see anybody pointing a gun at anybody over this, because I can't imagine that anybody could be that stupid. I mean, that'd be like Donald Trump following through with his, like, shooting somebody on Fifth Avenue stupid.
Right.
Like, we'd be getting to, like, that level of, like, you got a decent thing going here with the oil and stuff. Like, why don't you keep a country and not, like, I don't know what the next thing is. The only thing I can see is more economic and diplomatic isolation. But it seems pretty clear to me that Qatar is going to go with Turkey and Iran, which is kind of, presumably going with Iran is exactly the opposite effect of what he was shooting for, which is kind of interesting.
Yes, the exact opposite of what he was shooting for. And also, the last thing the United States wants is, again, for their biggest Air Force base in Asia, as far as I know, suddenly cozying up with the Iranians.
That does seem pretty, the Middle East is a weird place to have friends and enemies and frenemies.
Yes. Okay. Well, then two little silly stories, one of which I sent to Josh, about Qatar, and then we'll move on to what's going on in Syria, which is also about Turkey. The first silly story is one of the old school Saudi diplomat guys supposedly said to his American counterpart in the Department of State that Qatar wasn't a country; it was 300 people in a television station, which is a great joke. And the other one is that I also put this up, just sent it to Josh, that Qatar has banned showings of the new Wonder Woman movie because the star, the woman who plays Wonder Woman,
is an Israeli.
Israeli. So she can be a superhero in most of the world, and she's also almost a feminist superhero most of the world. But apparently in Qatar, she's just a Zionist bitch. and they can't put her on the screens for fear of I'm not sure what. But yes, they actually did that and said it and said it like, this is why we're doing this, because she was in the IDF and she's a sort of pro-Zionist Israeli, so therefore we can't show her movie in our country. So, and as we always say, our best friends in the region. There we go.
We have way too many best friends in that region.
We do have yes. I mean, one would almost be too much.
Actually, you sent me another fun Qatari story, which was after buying a place for apparently in consular or palace or home away from home in New York.
Yeah.
That they then bought up a building on the back end of that New York building on 73rd Street, just so they could redo it for all the maids.
For the
which
staff.
I thought was hysterical.
And it was and it was
like if you're somebody like me who actually like pays attention to New York real estate, you're just like, oh my god, fuck you guys.
Yes, and they paid $40 million for a house they could renovate for the maids. That's showing you have money. Okay, so on to our old standby for the past month or so, which is the only time that we've been doing this. Turkey is now threatening to roll in to Idlib. Is that correct?
That is, they at least seem to be putting out feelers to see who else would like to back that move.
Right.
Which is crazy I don't even know how to start with this one.
Well,
I mean, just in case everything else we talked about was pretty weird. Like, okay, so you're going to roll into a Syrian, nationalist area, an area that is a rebel group filled with the craziest people who've been displaced from every other part of Syria, and you're just going to declare it to be Turkish or something. I don't know. I need you to kind of lead off on this one.
Okay. So we've been talking about that sort of northern band of Syria, for quite some time. So as you go sort of west to east, is that right? Yes. No, east to west. The eastern,
it's like northwestern Syria. It's
right.
The Portland of Syria.
It's there you go. And what's been happening is that as government forces and as Kurdish forces and as Russian forces have been taking over and sometimes besieging for months different towns, in order to keep from having to fight house to house to house to house to house, what they've oftentimes been doing is striking deals with the craziest dingbat jihadi weirdos who are in those towns and saying, okay, you can keep, one gun, 2 changes of clothes, and 1 pair of shoes, and we'll put you on this bus and we'll drive you to another location where all your super crazy jihadi friends have already gone. And that's called Idlib. And it shares a border with Turkey, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So
and I do enjoy your description of you get, one gun. It's like, oh, here's your carry-on item.
Right, exactly.
AKM, assault rifle.
Right.
Like, in case of a cabin seizure,
right.
A gun will fall from ceiling, claim the front of the bus in the Impala. I just would love that safety wreck, for
exactly.
that bus. It's just got to be fantastic.
There's, there's exits over the wings, and you can go out that way, but you're not allowed to check your grenade launcher. There's only one carry-on per jihadi.
No, it's true, and they are not allowed heavy weapons, but they are willing. They're allowed to go out fully armed and with dependents.
Yes,
which strikes me as insane, partially because, oh my god, these crazy guys have wives,
have kids.
I can't get a date, and these people have dependents. Are you fucking kidding me? Jesus Christ, What am I doing wrong?
I was going to say
apparently I need to chop a couple of heads off or something, and up my game.
Stop yapping on the internet.
All horrible jokes aside. So crazy has been concentrating,
and they've been doing this on purpose. They've basically been saying we're gonna put them all in this one corner of the country, and it's fairly well defended on both sides by government forces on one side, and then by Russians and Kurds on the other side. Is that correct?
And Turks on the third.
Right.
And then water on another one. So it's nobody's getting out of that pocket.
Right. And we've been talking about this for a while now, saying when you start hearing about this, about things happening in this part of the country, that's when the end game is on us. That's going to be the last place, that's going to be the last house on the block that you're going to try to take. And now apparently the Turks are sending out feelers saying they want to go in there and take that. And this is also, by anybody's standards, sovereign territory of Syria, whatever Syria happens to be. This is not Turkish land, right?
No, absolutely. Like crazy jihadi rebel-controlled Syria.
Right. And apparently the Turks are planning on rolling in there. And from a strategic standpoint, why on earth would they do that? You tell us.
I really don't, again, with the, I kind of want you to lead off on this because I don't really have a good explanation for this one either. The only thing I can think of is that Turkish policy has failed so dramatically in that country. If the Turks had one single goal at the beginning of this, or maybe two goals, it'd be one, removing Assad. For some reason, they hate him. I never really understood why. But two, the last thing that they would ever want, and I think the last thing they ever even considered would be a possibility at the beginning of this Syrian conflict, is that there be a strong, organized Kurdish semi-state and military. And they have clearly absolutely failed on all points. Like, Assad is clearly going to be the guy in charge, or at least some flavor of, his regime.
Some version of it.
Is going to continue to be in power. Iran is going to have a major influence on him and is going to have a permanent presence there. The Russians are going to have a permanent presence near the Turkish border.
Right.
And the Kurds have their own nation state and army that is supplied by the biggest military power on the face of the earth.
Yeah.
So, the only thing I can think of that would motivate this situation is absolute desperation. That we have failed in every possible metric in our foreign policy at achieving even our own narrow-minded goals.
Right.
I don't really see how doubling down, again with the doubling down, and I think it's a bad decision.
Right.
Like, I think it's time to wash your hands of it. If I were the king of Saudi Arabia, or if I were Recep, I'd be like, all right, that one failed. Time to cash what chips in I have left and walk away. And in both cases, I just see them doubling down and trying to do something really stupid that I don't think is going to work out.
Right.
The other thing is that they support some of the rebels in those enclaves.
That is definitely true.
It's not official. It's not clear. It's not absolute. But it seems, I'm pretty sure you could find some Turkish, stamped equipment amongst their stuff.
Right.
That's always nebular because everyone sells everything. Everyone recaptures something. People are just like, oh, that's an American Humvee. The Americans are supporting that. Like, no, it's like everyone has an American Humvee now. Like, I have two of them myself.
Right.
So the point, it's not clear that the Turks are absolutely supporting some of the dishes that are in there. But it seems likely that at least some Turkish support, if not actually overtly from the military and the government at its highest level, are at least coming from their intelligence service.
Right.
One of those kind of reckless operations that even our intelligence agencies, are actually currently engaged in on the Jordanian border.
Right.
So it seems unclear to me, like, what's the end game then? Like, you're gonna liquidate these guys. Some of these guys you supplied. You
trained, and
some part of your country at some point probably gave some weapons to some of these guys, and you're gonna come in and try and liquidate them. And also, how does Syria feel about that? And how does Russia feel about that? Like, I don't even know where to begin on that. Like, on the one hand, I think somebody is just like, really? You want to jump on this grenade? Well, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, what do you think? I mean, what do you think? What would you think would the Syrian or the Russian reaction to, like, the Turkey just clearing out that area? But then, then the Turks, like, clearly have made themselves, if they can do it, which I'm not even convinced of, that gives them a seat at the table.
Yes. And the other thing that I find strange about the whole thing is if they were doing this a little bit further east in the country, sort of, down like down where the river is, you could sort of say, well, there's one last chance to try to stop a sort of coherent Kurdish mini state happening on their southern border. But this won't even do that. Like, this isn't even the part that will let them separate Kurdish groups from Kurdish groups. So
no, this is not a. Actually, that's another point that I was meaning to ask you. Is that, if anything, I just assumed that they would attack the separate, smaller Kurdish region in Afrin, which is not even part of the Raqqa effort.
Right.
And it's not clear to me whether the Americans would actually fight for that particular disjointed Kurdish area. But as far as I know, Russian troops are still based there.
Are still
so
there.
It seems
yes.
like the Syrians have apparently, or maybe just the Russians, because the Russians could probably call the shots if they want to, have basically signed off on, like, no, you can't do that.
You can't do that. That has to be my assumption. Was that given their choice, if Turkey was going to start, driving tanks south, they would drive them south there if they had.
They would do it into a Kurd area.
Yes,
that's their number one priority now. That's clear that
right.
Assad is not going to be displaced.
So
and instead they seem to be just randomly. They're just going to take the biggest part of the country that is rebel held outside of Kurdish areas and then try and attack it.
Yeah.
And I guess just so that they have a bigger slice of the table at the peace conference or whatever that hopefully happens by the end of this year.
Right.
And I just don't. It doesn't make any sense to me. That's an incredibly ambitious plan.
The only two things that make sense to me is what you're saying there, which is at this point there are so little options left even to have a seat at the table for Erdogan and his boys. So this is the only option left. What else can you do? The second one, the more devious, terrifying and horrible one, would be maybe if you could stir this part of the country so much, you could also stir up other parts of the country up that have been falling recently.
That they think to restart the war and get it going again.
Throw gasoline on the fire.
It's really gonna wrap up.
Right.
Wow, that's really freaking evil.
Yes. And I don't suspect that will work because I don't think the other players who are there would let that happen. But it is one especially nefarious, horrible, possible motivation that would at least make a sick, twisted sense.
It really doesn't make drastically less sense than the only other thing I can come up with.
Yeah.
Now, it's important to know that Turkey does have, effectively, it runs the Turkmen brigades, and they already do have a piece of Syria that they own.
Yes. Right.
And that divides, and this piece specifically divides the Kobani canton of Kurds, which are the Raqqa Kurds, the Raqqa-Rolos, as I like to call them,
yes,
from the Afrin Kurds.
Yep.
One of which basically has U.S. special forces running around it to make sure that if you try and shell them, that you might kill an American.
Right.
The other, which I still find surprising, quite honestly, I never got over this, has Russian special forces in it. So if you try and bomb that particular bunch of Kurds, you might piss off Russia.
Right.
Which is obviously also bad. They own that piece, and they are firmly secure where they're at. What I find shocking is that they're not just going to sit on that and hold.
Yeah.
Okay, we do have a tiny piece of the pie. We get some say in what happens to Syria at the end of the day, because we do effectively, it's practically the Turkish army.
Right.
They're clearly Turk-aligned, Turk-supported. I kind of don't understand why they would try and want to pick a bigger fight out of it. They have at least one piece of Syria that they firmly can sit on that nobody can really effectively take away with them.
Yeah.
And they could at least, negotiate that away, and they have no risk. They already have it. It's just something they can negotiate with. They don't have to stick their necks out. So the idea that Idlib is going to be a target for them is just that's I still have $20 left. Let me go all in.
Right.
Degenerate gambler move as far as foreign policy is concerned.
Right.
As far as I can tell.
Well,
maybe we're missing something, but it does seem like that level of crazy to me. Are you seeing anything different?
The only thing I came up with was what I said a few minutes ago, which is maybe they're trying to restart the whole thing again.
But that seems one, not only really mean, but two, just incredibly unlikely.
Yeah, to me, that's one of the only things that would actually fit a narrative that makes any sense. So I think we're going to have to just sit on this and wait, because this is going to start taking.
No, I think you're right. I don't think we really have a firm. Although I kind of feel like, 6 months from now, we'll just be like, nope, that still didn't make any sense.
That's
I kind of feel, no, we're going to have a lot of more clarity later on in this whole thing.
Fair enough. But and also oftentimes with these sort of actions, they start to clear themselves up when you at least get reports on what's actually happening, as opposed to people saying stuff like, oh, we'll, trade you Afrin for Idlib, or we'll do this or this or this. A lot of times when people start actually moving trucks around or not moving trucks around, it becomes a bit more clear. But it's certainly,
well, that's true. It could be a negotiating tactic.
Yeah.
That's possible.
But
there certainly have been a lot of reports of trucks moving around the Afrin canton of the Kurds.
Yeah.
So,
but
my biggest fear is that the Russians decide to pull up the tent stakes and move out of Afrin.
Right.
Because that, I think, would be a horrible slaughter. Because the Turks would immediately take that up.
Right.
I don't think that's going to happen, because I feel like if that was going to happen, it would already be doing, it would have already happened.
Right. Well, so again,
I think, we'll keep that open, put a pin in that, and we got one more topic, I believe.
Put a checkbox by that. And yes, our last topic is something that we've been, again, a bit of background. I always want to talk about Latin America, because I want to go live in Latin America, and I love Latin America. So I'm always fascinated by Latin American politics. Excuse me. And we've been watching a slow motion train wreck in Venezuela over the past couple of years. This goes back to 2014. And it appears as if the train wreck might finally be speeding up and actually happening. And that's for a whole bunch of reasons. But one of the stories this week that's finally sort of bubbled up into the proper Western American press is there's a woman who is the Venezuelan chief prosecutor, is her job title, which is sort of a combination of being the attorney general and the head of the FBI, because their legal system is structured differently than ours. And she was appointed by Hugo Chavez, and she's always been a very, very strong supporter of Chavismo, of the idea of the socialist revolution in Venezuela. And just in the past couple months, as people are getting murdered in the streets, and people are dying from malaria, and people are dying from AIDS, and all sorts of horrible things are happening in the country, she's trying to do a little bit of work to sort of hold some people in the country accountable for what's going on. And then this past week, showing, and also because of the way the government is structured, she can't be fired. Only the legislature can replace her. And Maduro, who's in charge of the Venezuelan government, just dissolved the legislature recently. So he's kind of in a tough spot, because I threw away the people who can get rid of this person I don't like. So I can't get rid of her without letting them come back into business.
Well, actually, my understanding was a little different.
Okay.
I thought that the Supreme Court, who are, for some reason that I don't understand, I'm guessing that he gets to appoint them,
Yep.
were hardcore Maduro supporters.
They are, yes.
And that the Supreme Court declared the legislature illegal and basically wiped them out and said they're not a legal body and we're going to start voting again.
Yes.
And then within 2 days of street protests, reversed itself and said, like, oh, just kidding. That we didn't really mean that. Well, and I believe she was actually an outspoken opponent against that Supreme Court decision. I think that's when she lost her Chavez, bona fides.
Yes.
At that point.
That was the beginning of this. That was a couple of months ago.
This is old history for what's now, as you say, kind of getting to be a fast-moving thing.
Right. And so what Maduro is trying to do now is, at the end of this month, on July 30th, there's supposed to be a sort of snap election for a new legislative body that will rewrite the Constitution. So they're going to redo the whole deal, which this attorney general woman also opposes. So what happened now is the Maduro government came out and basically took her passport and froze her bank accounts. And she responded by asking, let me get the name of the organization here. She responded by appealing to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights both for herself and for everyone who works in her department. So Venezuela is now at a point where their equivalent of the Attorney General and the FBI is asking the UN to please save them from the president. That's
right.
That's how far we've gone. Her name is Luisa Ortega Diaz. So she basically said, she went out to the press and said, if I turn up, dead in a river, this is the guy who did it to me, and please come and help out my friends. That may be a slight exaggeration. But it's a very, very...
I don't feel that's like super far from where their politics are right now.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's important. I mean, it's important to note that like their Supreme Court it'd be like if our Supreme Court decided, by the way, the House and the Senate, you guys are illegitimate. All of you out of a job. We're going to hire a whole bunch of new guys instead of you guys, and that's it.
Right.
Which is, there's not even a mechanism for that,
right.
And they just did it anyway.
Right.
Which is kind of insane.
Yes.
So even by their standards of their own politics and their rules, that's not like a thing that happens.
Yes. And also the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is actually part of the Organization of American States, which is a group that has been threatening to throw Venezuela out of it for a while, and Venezuela keeps on saying, "Screw you! You can't fire me. I quit." About all that sort of stuff. But the piece of this puzzle that I think is a little bit odd that maybe we can talk about some is in the history of Latin American politics. When something gets this bad in a country, the traditional thing that happens is either the U.S. engineers a coup, or the military engineers a coup, or more likely,
or the army takes over.
Right. Yes. Or the U.S. helps the army take over. And that hasn't happened at all. There is there's she is the first part of the state that has broken ranks with the Maduro government. Nobody in the army has. Nobody in the other state structures has. Nobody in their equivalent of the State Department, their foreign policy group has. So like people are dying in the streets. Like babies are being born with diseases that like kids aren't getting vaccinated, so they're dying of like whooping cough and shit. Like the country is a basket case, and
like penicillin is something you cannot find in that country anymore.
Yeah, you can't get antibiotics. And there are like people are on Venezuelan Craigslist buying and selling like their high blood pressure medication. Like it's gone to hell. And still only this woman, Luisa Ortega Diaz, I have her name right in front of me, is basically the first part of the government who is willing to come out and say, okay, this is madness. We have to do something else. No one in the military has, no one anywhere else has. Which to me just seems like if you were in charge of this, if you were, a major general in this military, I would think you'd be worried about the post-Maduro world, right? But apparently they're not.
Even if you don't have a moral bone in your body,
right? Yes,
you got to kind of wonder, like, if this totally doesn't pan out. I mean, if this place defaults, if this place stops producing oil, if we don't get paid, at the end of the day, like, what happens?
Someone's going to come chop my head off.
Man, it's just been a weird news week, and I think it's worth also throwing down one of the crazier, even though it has almost no actual significance whatsoever, just as a WTF moment for Venezuela. I remember, like, earlier this week, last week, there was a police helicopter that was commandeered by people who apparently were anti-Maduro police officers, who then attacked the Supreme Court building.
The building.
With pistols and grenades from their helicopter.
And it was like...
Which is just kind of like one of the most what the fuck headlines I have ever read. And, like...
Yeah.
Not, like, if that happened in, like, Somalia, you'd be like, oh, yeah, of course they did. Don't they do that every other day? But, like, in Venezuela, like, hypothetically is, like, a legitimate democracy. It's got the most oil reserves of, like, practically any country in the entire world.
In the world, yes.
And here we are where, like, they're like, these effectively, like, though Comey is like being like, by the way, I'm probably gonna like be killed.
Right.
And also, like, random cops like decided to defect and just drop grenades on their Supreme Court
And shoot
which,
guns.
While ineffective, still like symbolically, is just like, holy crap! Can you imagine if like some U.S. police officers stole a helicopter and dropped grenades on the Supreme Court in the U.S.? Like, we would be losing our minds 6 months later.
And just to take the level of absurdity one little bit up, the pilot who flew that helicopter is actually a police pilot who also is sort of a budding movie star. He's had small roles in television shows as a pilot or as a cop. So it's basically like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson got in a helicopter and flew over the Supreme Court and started shooting at it.
No, because Dwayne wouldn't have missed.
Well,
it's The Rock, man.
It's The Rock.
You would be able to smell what The Rock was cooking after he was done.
Right. But it's that level of absurd, which again, even by, I mean, I love Latin America to death, but the politics sometimes can walk the line between, tragedy and farce rather quickly. But even by those standards, that's like just completely out there. But again, like one of the questions that I think you can comment on as well, is, we've been saying for a long time, what has to go wrong? What else can go wrong? And then something else does, and then nothing happens. And I think it's because there is nobody with any power is willing to switch sides to the opposition. And by power, I mean military or political.
Guns.
Right.
Yeah.
And the military is just...
I think, quite honestly, I think it just comes down to guns at this point. It's really clear that it's not... The government isn't working. The opposition is going to be sidelined one way or the other. I mean, I say civil war. You say it's not a thing that's going to happen. If there isn't a civil war, I feel like the only reason it won't happen is because there's nobody with any kind of capability to actually make anything go boom on the opposition side. But it's clearly just a failed democracy and a failed country.
Yes.
And it's only going to get worse. I feel there's like a 100% chance that Venezuela defaults. And it's just a question of when.
On their bonds, I don't think there's any question about that. Yeah. But it's a matter of when, and they're so cheap now that if they pay them for the next 18 months, you might still make money if you own them. Yeah.
I mean, it's an exercise in kicking the can, but the thing that feeds their economy, oil, is exactly the thing that they don't have enough money now to invest in to keep it going. Their production has dropped off by something like just horrible, like 30%. Like when you need to have the most money you can, like you've mismanaged your entire situation such that you can no longer produce the thing that makes you money.
You can't even get spare parts for the stuff anymore.
And they still haven't quite stopped giving oil to Cuba, which I just find insane. It's like, it's socialism first. Our people can't get penicillin, but oil to Cuba, we haven't quite finished that program yet.
And one of the reasons
insane.
One of the reasons that happened one of the reasons the OAS, the Organization of American States vote, went their way is because the OAS is a one country one vote organization. So Mexico has the same number of votes as Turks and Caicos.
Oh, right. So that is basically bribe money.
Right. So there's a bunch of tiny little countries like Cuba. Jamaica was another one where they've been living on very small shipments. I mean, they're not big places, on fairly small shipments of Venezuelan oil. So those votes were just bought.
Okay, I kind of wondered why that was still possibly an acceptable thing.
Yeah,
and you just answered my question. Yeah. I was not aware of that.
Which also then makes you wonder, why didn't the U.S. come in and say to Jamaica and Cuba, "We'll give you the oil"? Like.
Yeah.
I mean, how much could it cost? $10, $15, $20 million? It couldn't have been much money by American standards.
Well, on the other hand, I just feel like America doesn't really care. At the end of the day, to the extent Venezuela creates oil, they will sell it to us because they don't have a choice. Right. One of the incredibly ironic thing about Venezuela's oil industry is, as much as Chavez hates the United States and calls them like the new evil empire or whatever when he was alive, and Maduro in his place, they sell all of their oil to us.
Pretty much
because
pretty much
of
all of it to the
distance,
US.
and also because they lack the ability to refine it
Yep.
in their own. And for some reason, the industry around Louisiana and Texas is like, perhaps just because of their oil, perhaps because I don't know if offshore oil in our country is equally sulfurous, but they have the ability to refine it down.
Yep.
And then the greater irony of all of that is that now that their infrastructure is so damaged and they have problems refining oil, they now buy on the order of 50,000 to 70,000 barrels a day from us.
Right.
To mix light sweet crude from shale oil into their stuff, so that their stuff is more easily refined.
So they can ship it.
So they're actually buying about 10% of their oil from us.
Yes.
And then mixing it down and selling it back to us.
Selling it back to us. Yep.
Which is just like, I was like, again with the like, oh my God, has everyone gone crazy? Like, This is just, how did we get to this point?
It's like it's like they're marrying bottles in a bar. You know, you've got your like, so we take this thing of Sobieski and put it in our bottle of Absolute and sell it. Yeah, it's that bad, and also the U.S. buys 700,000 barrels of oil a day from Venezuela.
Yeah, it is not an inconsequential
third,
and that is all. That's just the U.S. buy, like, and that's straight to the U.S. That's not like the world's buy. That's the U.S. buy. 700,000
barrels a day. So if suddenly that quits showing up, that would be a serious problem in the United States. Like, we couldn't suddenly be out 700,000 barrels for very long and not have that be an issue for us.
I mean, that would actually. I feel like if that somehow happened overnight, that would kind of push. We always said oil will always live around $50, but if you shut down a country like Venezuela, that's one of those like dark swan issues that would just push everything up to triple-digit land.
Yeah, for the short term, it absolutely would.
Probably not long term, but like in like the overnight panic of that would probably push it up near there anyway. Serious problems.
Okay, well that's I think that covers it for us for this week. You know, like I said, the Attorney General, the James Comey, and the Sally Yates of Venezuela is now asking outside powers to make sure that she doesn't get thrown in jail. Just stop and think about that for a minute.
The Saudis are doubling down on a ridiculous list of demands that Qatar will absolutely never meet, and Qatar is having Turkish troops based on its soil, and the United Arab Emirates is declaring it an escalation.
Yes.
So that's happening.
And Turkey's invading Idlib. So actually, the really the really fun, cheerful part about this is the European banking system is going to help.
Yeah, I'm like, that's kind of, the Italians is going ciao. It's kind of the bright spot.
Yeah, really. Sort of like, exactly, ciao. All right, well, so then on that, why don't we close this one out, and we will talk again in a week. Does that sound okay to you?
That sounds great.
All right, well, as we said, my name is Thad. I am Thad at squidjigger.com. The other side is Josh. I'm sorry, I'm TCB at squidjigger.com. And Josh is Josh at squidjigger.com. And if anyone hears this, please